Hello, welcome to the further discussion on the American government and the American election of 2022 between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The uh, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about some of the lessons that might be learned from the election and how that might transfer further into political action in the next coming years. My name is Guy Charlton. I am the lecturer in American government law, American constitutional law, and politics. And this course uh, enables us to look at various constitutional doctrines relating to rights in the United States. And we know that rights is an important aspect of the political system in many countries, including ours and here in Australia. So there's a couple of things would like to talk about. Actually, I'm going to talk about specifically five things, which which are lessons that can be drawn from this election, and this may give us uh, further points to consider moving forward in terms of how politics and law will unfold in the United States. The first notion that came out of the election was this notion of the repudiation of Donald Trump and his style of politics. Prior to the election, there were quite a bit of noise about uh, Trump's style of politics, and that this divisive, uh, personal ad hominem attacks, the use of Twitter, the constant sense of media chaos was not a way in which the American electorate wanted their president to act. And to this extent, his defeat by almost 5 million votes, I think now at this point, is a repudiation of his style of politics and perhaps his policies. At the same time, Donald Trump did secure 10 million more votes than what he secured in 2016. So, despite with a record turnout, uh, Joseph Biden won more votes than any other person in American history. But nonetheless, Donald Trump bettered his 2016 results, and to that extent, it's not clear whether or not the election was a per se repudiation of Trumpism. He still had positive views among the electorate in terms of his handling of the economy. So, from the point of view of the election, on one hand, it's a defeat, but it doesn't look like it's the repudiation that many Democrats and many pundits were looking for. The second notion is uh, is that the election shows a change in the electorate and change in what would be traditionally safe voting blocks, safe states for either the Democratic or the Republican Party. In the case of the Republican Party, the GOP, the we see the now solid South, which has been overwhelmingly Republican, voted overwhelmingly Republican over the last 30 or so years, begin to shift towards more competitive jurisdictions. Georgia went for Joe Biden. We see North Carolina becoming a swing state. We see Texas, the vote moving towards Texas, and of course, Florida remains perpetually a swing state uh, for the electorate. But the GOP for many election cycles could count on the South to deliver their votes to their candidates, and in fact, that's no longer the case. The second aspect is within the states there is this. There has been a strong support for the Republicans within the suburbs, the rings of bedroom communities around American cities. The Republican candidates have traditionally benefited from overwhelming support from the Republicans. And in this election, you saw the Republicans actually swing away from the GOP and provided that margin of difference for Joe Biden's victory. So the suburbs within the American electorate have now become much more competitive and moved away from the Republican Party. At the same time, the Democrats have seen their advantage among persons of color and those voting blocks, ethnic voting blocks, become challenged. President Trump, in particular, was able to make inroads into the Latino constituencies. The Latino community, quite large voting bloc in the United States, has been assumed by Democrats to be overwhelmingly Democratic, but in fact, the Latino vote has not been owned by the Democrats, and has not. They need to compete in this field, as many of their congressional candidates have talked about during the election. There was the notion that Latino community was taken for granted. Of course, the Latino community in Florida was probably Trump's margin of victory there. Trump was very effective in painting the Democrats as socialists, which in the case of maybe Northern Americans from the northern part of the United States, they think of socialists as Scandinavians, welfare state, whereas for many Latino voters and newly immigrant voters from Latin America, socialist means Hugo Chavez and Cuban and Castro, Cuban voters. So the presumption is the implications of that term did not work in the Democrats' favor. At the other time, the so-called blue wall in the American Electoral College, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which have traditionally been swing states, but have more often than not swung towards the Democrats, have now become much more competitive. That, in fact, it is, rather than the Democrats being able to put these states in as a done deal, they're in fact now going to need to compete within those states and to not take those states for granted in terms of their voting blocks. So the Democrats and these states, from a Democratic point of view, are no longer safe, and various groups which they have counted on, traditionally people of color, African American males, Latinos, have been moving. The Republicans were able to make some inroads, and of course that in itself goes to the first point, is that whether or not the election was a repudiation of Trump or Trumpism, or whatever policies are entailed in Trumpism, the economic nationalism, anti-immigration policies. It's not clear from the election where the overall electorate is going on these issues. The next point in the election is that you see an increasingly entrenched rural red, meaning the Republican Party, rural versus urban blue divide. You're seeing the United States, if you look at the electoral map, but also within states, you are seeing a split where Republicans are increasingly becoming dominant in rural areas. And of course, this notion of rural area dominance is related to the relative lack of economic success compared to Democratic districts and cities within the United States. So you're seeing this urban-rural split, this Democrat-Republican split. Democratic districts in general do better economically than Republican districts. And this urban-rural split is reminiscent of American politics, say in the 1920s, that you see these differences become very much entrenched. And of course, from a class analysis where individuals who are poor, who would look for more to the state for welfare issues. Of course, that gives one pause to use a class analysis to determine economic voting behavior within the United States. The next notion in the election that comes out of it is that this notion of progressive, the American electorate moving left, becoming embracing progressive issues, has not quite been borne out. What's more interesting is that progressive politics, progressive issues are all over the map. So Florida, which voted, for instance, for President Trump and the Republicans, the voters there approved a $15 an hour minimum wage. In California, a highly progressive state, there was a referendum as to whether Uber drivers should be treated as regular workers, so entitled to workers' compensation and all the protections as regular workers, as opposed to independent contractors. This measure was defeated. So you see in some states, conservative states went for Trump, approval of recreational marijuana, for instance. So the progressive nature of the American electorate has, these policies have not been ideologically put together on the left, but rather the people who support these progressive politics are able to pick and choose what politics they support. So to that extent, the American electorate may be less polarized than one might think at first blush, that there are policy prescriptions that are not based on sort of ideological normative values that say we should do certain things. So those politics, progressive policies, are all over the map. That doesn't mean to underscore the next point, that the American polity remains extremely polarized. This polarization has made it increasingly difficult for politicians on either side of the aisle to compromise and work with members of the opposite party. And of course, the American system in general needs this cooperation, so it can freeze up. So the first one, it makes it difficult because the bases of both parties remain highly polarized, highly antagonist to each other. As President-elect Biden said, there's a demonization process that's going on in the United States with your political opponents. And you can see this polarization playing out, and President Trump's continued refusal to, in fact, concede the election. That he is continually doubled down on his accusations of fraud, which are pretty well it's pretty well been documented that they're fraudulent claims, that there has been no fraud in this election, that stole the election from President Trump. But nonetheless, this narrative has been continually pushed by the president, and there's been very little pushback, at least on the national level, by prominent Republicans. And so this feeds into this polarization, because unlike other elections where there's a concession, there's an acceptance by the opposition of their defeat at the hands of the voters, you're not seeing this. So this could re-entrench polarization within the United States. I'm not sure. My view is that I think the polarization within the American electorate is not as deep as perhaps other observers might suggest. The reason why is I think there's a broad agreement on a set of policy issues within the United States, but there's a lot of political and ideological noise that makes individuals seem more ideological than they really are. And again, that's my impression, but there is no question that the polarization that's in the electorate is much greater than it was 20 years ago. And part of that polarization has been because of the presidency of Donald Trump. It was occurring in the same way, but the presidency of Donald Trump has really entrenched that polarization. And we'll see if the new president-elect Biden will be able to actually get around that and get some substantive policy differences. Trump displayed his majority even in Congress his first 2 years, was really unable to implement any real policies, and much of his policies were through executive action. And the final point on this election, which is a point that was made in 2016, which is the polls were clearly wrong, were clearly incorrect, that the changes that were made to polling methodologies after the 2016 election, for instance, to set up separate categories for uneducated, non-university educated people, this hasn't been as effective. That the people are not answering polls as well. They're not being as truthful. But the polls were spectacularly off. Now, we'll see as the final results come in how much off they'll be. But there's no question that Biden's victory, which is substantial at over 5 million votes, nonetheless was less than what was predicted. And the down ballot races, the Senate races in those states for the senator, the congressional races for representative, and state level races were in fact predicted. More of a blue wave was predicted, but in fact the Democrats in many instances lost seats. So the polls themselves are wrong, and these have real implications for political campaigns, because they make the spending decisions on where to advertise, where to go, that are based on these polls. So, for instance, in Maine, Senator Susan Collins, a Republican, moderate Republican, was predicted to lose fairly substantially by against her Democratic opponent, former Speaker of the House of Maine. And the Democrats, in effect, didn't campaign much there in the sense that they thought this was a gimme pickup in the American Senate. But in fact, Collins, who had never led in any polls, in fact, won fairly handily in Maine. And so these polls have real implications for campaigns, for campaign decisions, as well as voters themselves, because campaign polling actually affects voting behavior, as we've seen in the Brexit circumstance. So these points are all have come out of the 2020 election, and again, as time goes on, there'll be more lessons that'll come out of the election and come out of the various views of how the electorate acted in the 2020 election. And of course, a continuing story is President Trump's continuing double down on fraudulent voting behavior, despite the fact that American officials at both the state and the federal election have said this was the most secure election ever, and his refusal to concede and allow for a transition. So this is an ongoing issue, and I think that it might deserve a podcast in and of itself. But if we can get to it as the story unfolds, we'll come back to it. So, thank you for your time. Fascinating issues of politics and of elections, and of course, these have implications for rights and law and how we conceive of political discourse over time. Thank you, and good day.